The Oslo Accords of 1993 marked a turning point in the modern history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, reshaping political expectations, institutional structures, territorial control, and the strategic logic that continues to influence the dynamics of Israel's wars on Gaza. Although Oslo was conceived as a peace framework aimed at ending decades of conflict through mutual recognition and gradual steps toward Palestinian self-rule, its design, implementation, and eventual breakdown deeply affected Gaza political trajectory and the recurring cycles of violence that define Israeli military operations there today. At the heart of the Oslo Accords was mutual recognition between the State of Israel and the Palestine Liberation Organization. For the first time, Israel formally acknowledged the PLO as the legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. While the PLO recognized Israel's right to exist and renounced armed struggle, this shift transformed the conflict from one framed primarily as a revolutionary or liberation struggle into a negotiated political process. Gaza, which had long been a center of Palestinian resistance and had experienced direct Israeli military administration since 1967, was positioned under Oslo as one of the first territories to experience Palestinian self-rule. This decision was intended to build trust and demonstrate the tangible benefits of peace. However, it also meant that Gaza became an experimental space where the successes and failures of Oslo were most visible. The establishment of the Palestinian Authority under Oslo fundamentally altered governance in Gaza. Israeli forces withdrew from population centers, transferring limited administrative and security responsibilities to Palestinian institutions. While this reduced the daily visibility of Israeli occupation in some areas, it did not end Israeli control over borders, airspace, maritime access, population registry, or economic movement. This partial withdrawal created a layered system of authority that blurred responsibility. Israel retained ultimate control over Gaza's external environment, while the Palestinian Authority bore the burden of internal governance, service delivery, and policing. Over time, this division of power generated frustration among Palestinians, who experienced continued restrictions without the political sovereignty Oslo had promised. This frustration fed into broader disillusionment with negotiations and contributed to the erosion of Palestinian support for the Oslo framework. The Oslo process also reshaped Palestinian politics in ways that directly influenced Gaza's later role in conflict. Groups such as Hamas and Islamic Jihad rejected Oslo from the outset, viewing it as a surrender of fundamental Palestinian rights, particularly the right of return and full sovereignty over historic Palestine. Gaza, with its dense refugee population and history of resistance, became a stronghold for these rejectionist movements. The Palestinian Authority's attempts to suppress militant activity in Gaza, often under Israeli and international pressure, deepened internal Palestinian divisions. These tensions weakened the legitimacy of the PA in Gaza and laid the groundwork for Hamas's eventual electoral victory in 2006. And its takeover of the territory in 2007. Security arrangements under Oslo had long-term implications for Israel's military approach to Gaza. The accords emphasized security cooperation, with the Palestinian Authority tasked with preventing attacks on Israelis. When this cooperation faltered, particularly during periods of heightened violence such as the Second Intifada, Israel increasingly viewed Palestinian self-rule areas not as partners but as security threats. Gaza, in this context, came to be seen less as a territory moving towards statehood and more as a hostile entity requiring containment. This perception influenced Israel's later strategy of disengagement in 2005, when it withdrew settlements and permanent ground forces from Gaza while maintaining control over its periphery. Although disengagement was not formally part of Oslo, it was shaped by the logic Oslo introduced, separating populations while managing security unilaterally. The collapse of the Oslo peace process during the Second Intifada had profound consequences for Gaza. The uprising shattered the assumption that gradual confidence building would lead to a negotiated settlement. For Israel, the failure reinforced skepticism about Palestinian intentions and the effectiveness of negotiated security arrangements. For Palestinians, especially in Gaza, it confirmed the belief that negotiations had failed to end occupation or deliver meaningful independence. This mutual disillusionment hardened attitudes on both sides and normalized the use of force as a primary tool of policy. Gaza increasingly became the arena where this hardened dynamic played out, with Israel relying on military deterrence and Hamas and other groups relying on armed resistance. Economically, Oslo's framework contributed to Gaza's long-term vulnerability. The accords envisioned economic cooperation and development, but in practice, Gaza remained dependent on Israel for trade, labor, access, and movement. Periodic closures, restrictions, and security measures disrupted economic life and entrenched poverty. When Hamas took control of Gaza and Israel imposed a blockade, these economic weaknesses were exacerbated. The blockade, often justified by Israel as a security necessity, can be traced back to Oslo's failure to establish clear economic sovereignty for Palestinian territories. Gaza's economic isolation intensified humanitarian crises, which in turn fueled anger, radicalization, and cycles of violence that repeatedly escalated into war. The political fragmentation institutionalized after Oslo also influenced the dynamics of Israeli wars on Gaza. The split between the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank and Hamas in Gaza created a situation in which Gaza was politically isolated not only from Israel but also from much of the international community and even from other Palestinians. Israel's military operations in Gaza have often been framed as conflicts with Hamas, rather than with the Palestinian people as a whole. This framing is rooted in the post-Oslo reality, where there is no single, unified Palestinian leadership capable of negotiating or enforcing comprehensive agreements. As a result, ceasefires are typically temporary and fragile, addressing immediate security concerns without resolving underlying political issues. Oslo also affected international engagement with Gaza. The accords generated widespread international investment in the peace process, with donors supporting Palestinian institutions and development projects. When the process collapsed and Hamas took control of Gaza, much of this support was withdrawn or restricted. Gaza became increasingly marginalized in diplomatic efforts, treated as a humanitarian problem rather than a political one. This depoliticization reinforced a cycle in which military confrontations were managed through ceasefires and aid deliveries rather than through renewed political negotiations. The absence of a credible political horizon, a core promise of Oslo, left Gaza trapped in a state of perpetual crisis. From Israel's perspective, the legacy of Oslo shaped the doctrine used in wars on Gaza. The belief that negotiated solutions had failed contributed to a reliance on deterrence, military superiority, and periodic operations aimed at degrading militant capabilities. These operations are often justified as necessary responses to rocket fire or other attacks, but they are also influenced by the absence of a broader peace framework. Without a viable political process, military action becomes the default tool for managing threats. This approach, however, tends to reinforce rather than resolve the underlying conflict, as each round of violence deepens hostility and mistrust. For Gaza's population, the influence of Oslo is felt in the daily realities of life under blockade and recurring war. The promise of self-rule and eventual independence raised expectations that were never fulfilled. The gap between those expectations and lived reality contributed to a sense of betrayal and hopelessness. This psychological dimension is crucial to understanding Gaza's role in the conflict. Repeated wars are not only military events but also social and political experiences shaped by decades of unmet promises and failed agreements. In a broader sense, Oslo altered the narrative of the conflict in ways that continue to affect Gaza. Before Oslo, the conflict was often framed in terms of occupation and liberation. After Oslo, it became framed as a peace process gone wrong, with disputes over security, borders, and governance. Gaza's wars are often interpreted through this lens, as breakdowns in security rather than as symptoms of an unresolved struggle for self-determination. This framing influences international responses, media coverage, and policy decisions, often prioritizing short-term stability over long-term justice. The influence of the Oslo Accords on the dynamics of Israel's wars on Gaza is therefore complex and enduring. Oslo reshaped governance, politics, security doctrines, economic structures, and expectations on both sides. Its partial implementation and ultimate failure did not end the conflict, but transformed it, producing a fragmented political landscape and a cycle of violence centered on Gaza. Each war on Gaza is not an isolated event, but part of a continuum that began with the hopes raised in 1993 and the disappointments that followed. Understanding this legacy is essential to understanding why Gaza remains a focal point of conflict and why military solutions have repeatedly failed to deliver lasting peace.